Okay then. Well, welcome everybody. Greetings to you all. And I'm Josephine Beoku-Betts. I'd like, of course, we're here. This is our first virtual plenary session of the conference, and it's been going so well so far. So we promised you a really good session today. The title of our session today is Celebrating 50 Years of SWS Through a Decade's Perspective. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of Mignon, President-elect and co-chair of the 50th Anniversary Committee and the 50th Anniversary Committee, which is constituted of Judith Lorber, Bandana, Purkayastha, Pam Roby, Shaniqua Simpson, Marlese Durr, Mary Romero, Denise Segura, Barrett, Katuna, Jamie Hartless, Mignon Moore, and myself. Would like to congratulate SWS on its 50th anniversary, at least the beginning of its 50th anniversary celebrations. We look forward to a year ahead of events to celebrate how far we've come, and with the knowledge that the best still lies ahead of us. We had initially planned to hold this plenary at Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco, where the conference was going to take place, but and the Glide Memorial Church is where the initial discussions on SWS took place in 1969. But unfortunately, COVID-19 happened and has led us all to be here virtually today. But I think it's quite fortuitous for us, and because there are many members who otherwise would not have been able to attend that conference, and they're all here with us today to celebrate and mark the occasion. So, you know, that's a good thing for us. So I just want to say a little bit about Glide Memorial Church and its significance for SWS. Glide Memorial United Methodist Church has held a very significant place in the history of San Francisco, particularly the Tenderloin district, where it has provided various services for the poor and the disenfranchised since the 1960s and 1970s during the War on Poverty. And currently, among its many services, this church is still providing services such as 750,000 free meals a day, a year, through its community clinic to the homeless. It has a licensed childcare and after-school program. It provides shelter for the homeless. It provides HIV testing, mental and primary health care, women's programs, job skills training, free legal services for the homeless. And it's done a lot of work historically for the LGBTQ community in San Francisco. In relation to its significance for SWS, I draw on a couple, I draw on a publication by Heather Lobby and Beth Hess, which was published in 2001. And they said that Glide Memorial Church was very significant in terms of the emergence of SWS, because it's where the initial discussions took place among women sociologists who were attending the annual ASA conference in San Francisco in 1969. And these conversations were precipitated by discriminatory practices against women sociologists at the hotel restaurant where the ASA was taking place at the time. And women sociologists were denied service during, quote unquote, the men's lunch hour, because it was felt their conversations would disrupt discussions among the male membership. However, these were also critical spaces where strategizing on decisions affecting the good of the membership and the future of the organization were taking place. So, and then I also draw on Mary Frank Fox's reflection essay, and which I paraphrase, but she says that during the 1970 meetings of the American Sociological Association, 75 women gathered as a caucus in Washington, DC, and they decided that they needed a permanent organization, and they scheduled a meeting to follow at Yale University. And this is how actually SWS was born. And so I want to thank all our founding mothers and to all who have contributed over the years to bringing us to where we are today. And our plenary today is made up of not, of course, not all the presidents or council members, but representatives for different decades. And so we will be speaking in that order. But I'd like to now introduce our moderator for the session, Mignon Moore. So Mignon is president-elect of SWS, and she's a professor of sociology at Barnard College and Columbia University, and she's chair of Barnard Sociology. Her first book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, won the 2012 Distinguished Book Award from the ASA Sex and Gender section. Her current work examines health and social support for sexual minority seniors, and she is completing a book titled In the Shadow of Sexuality, Social Histories of African American LGBT Elders, 1950 to 1979. Mignon's research has been supported by awards from the National Institutes of Health, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Early Career Award. She's past chair of the Race, Gender, and Class section of the ASA, and was recently elected to the Executive Committee for the Association of Black Sociologists. Look forward to reading your new book, Mignon, and welcome. And I hand over everything to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to begin by saying hello and welcome. And it is very nice to gather with such a distinguished group of individuals on this occasion of the SWS summer meetings. I'd like to introduce the panelists, and I'll introduce each panelist right before they speak so that we can have a context in which to understand their remarks. And I do want to, again, say thank you to Josephine for working so hard to organize such a thoughtful and integrated panel. Judith Lorber is our first speaker this afternoon. She is Professor Emerita of Sociology and Women's Studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate School of the City University of New York. As we all know, she's the author of many books, including Breaking the Bowels, Degendering and Feminist Change, Gender Inequality, Feminist Theories in Politics, Paradoxes of Gender and Women, Physicians, Careers, Status, and Power. With Lisa Jean Moore, she's author of Gendered Bodies, Feminist Perspectives, and Gender and the Social Construction of Illness. She was president of SWS from 1980 to 1982. And she was secretary from 1974 to 77 and was the founding editor of Gender and Society. Please, welcome, Professor Lorber.
Thank you. I'm going to speak about the 1970s, and I'm taking my information mostly from SWS Network, that include the newsletter, at issues from August 1971 to July 1982. When SWS began, there were no women on ASA's 11-member executive committee with 30-member council. There had been only one woman president since ASA's inception in 1905, Dorothy Swain Thomas, in 1952. Mira Komorowski was elected ASA president in 1973, but it took 10 years before Alice Rossi was elected in 1983. So SWS's first goal was to increase the presence of women in ASA leadership and also on its invited meeting panels. SWS's efforts were to start with getting women elected to the nominations committee and the committee on committees. Behind the scenes, SWS members distributed CVs of women to the members of these committees. And there was also a lobby sit-in over the lack of women on the program when William Sewell was president in 1971 that I remember taking part in. For comparison, the 2019-2020 leadership roster included only one man, Alden Morris, president-elect among 7 officers. In recognition of the rampant discrimination against women in academia, SWS petitioned ASA to create a committee on the status of women in sociology and a section on sex roles, which is later called the section on sex and gender. SWS's purpose, as published in the October-November 1971 issue of the newsletter, was, quote, dedicated to maximizing the effectiveness of and professional opportunities for women in sociology, exploring the contributions which sociology can, does, and should make to the investigation and humanization of current sex roles, and improving the quality of human life. Over the next 4 years, subsequent mid-year weekend meetings expanded to about 40 people and covered a lot of the business and ongoing issues of SWS. We met in Washington, D.C. in a room that was donated by ASA. Oddly enough, we fought for a free meeting room at the ASA summer meetings for several years. We tried to subsidize travel expenses, but needed an additional source of money to do so. In 1976, Arlene Kaplan Daniels, she was president then, came up with the idea of transforming mid-years into a road show. We would meet on campuses before and after the meeting, and members would offer their services. Before and after the meeting, members would offer their services to presentations to the faculty and students at that campus. The honoraria were then used for subsidizing travel and other expenses for the meeting. And the presentations were also a way of introducing SWS and increasing our visibility and membership. Now, of course, the SWS Winter Meeting is a conference in and of itself. Expanding out from ASA, SWS saw its mission as fighting the discrimination of women in all the colleges and universities on hiring, promotion, tenure, and salary. The newsletter listed jobs postings in every issue, and SWS tried to get ASA behind this fight. And others got involved with SSSB and ISA, the International Sociological Association, and sociology associations. A major battle in the 1970s was over SWS endorsements of ASA candidates. Until we could get more women on the ASA ballot, SWS in 1972 began the practice of endorsing candidates for ASA office. The endorsements by the SWS Steering Committee were based on a survey of candidates using first questions related directly to ASA, such as, are you in support of the SWS resolution that the ASA appoint a special officer for women's equity? What specific steps would you favor having the ASA take to assure equal opportunity for all ASA members? What has been your personal position regarding affirmative action programs on your campus or in your agency? And what concrete action have you taken to support your policy? The answers from candidates for top office, council, and publications, nominations, and committee on committees were published in the winter 1973 newsletter and took up 13 pages. 3 women running for the committee on committees answered. In the end, there were 5 women and 26 men. Questions were later reduced to 2, more generally based on overall feminist stances. By 1974, the survey and endorsement of ASA candidates was coming under scrutiny as energy and time consuming and generating indistinguishable socially desirable answers. Helen McGill Hughes suggested publishing pertinent facts from the candidates' CVs and publications and using those as the basis of SWS endorsements. As in 1982, candidates were endorsed by the steering committee at the mid-years based on two criteria. Quote, one, whether the candidate has a public record of feminist activities, and two, whether the candidate can be counted on to vote feminist in ASA office. Two or more candidates could be endorsed for any office, and the enlisted endorsements included the basis for the endorsements. The July 1982 issue of the newsletter included 6 pages of debate by various authors on whether to continue endorsements of ASA candidates. There had been what was described as a lengthy and lively debate over endorsements at the 1982 mid-years. The report of the ad hoc committee on endorsements said, quote, over the years, an increasing number of people have expressed reservations about this process in terms of its appropriateness, divisiveness, effectiveness, and fairness. Many people feel it is one of the most important activities of SWS, while others believed it to be divisive. My own point of view, I was president then, was to quote, if a point is ever reached where active feminists are a majority of ASA offices and committee members, as is true with SSSP and some of the regional societies, then endorsements will be superfluous. At the summer meeting in Montreal in 1982, we had a meeting attended by over 200 people, which voted on whether to continue endorsements. The vote was evenly split between keeping and abolishing endorsements. Rose Weiss, who I bless forever, proposed that we keep the survey so voters can make up their own minds about who to vote for, but end endorsements. As you know, that's what we have been doing ever since, with the candidates listing their sociological accomplishments and their activities on behalf of women, whether they belong to SWS and what they have done with and for SWS. I, for one, rely on the annual survey to pick whom I vote for. The 70s activities were described by Pam Roby, who was president in 1978-80, and she wrote a 40-year retrospective on SWS, which was published in the winter 2009 issue of Network News. She wrote of the 70s to quote, within sociology, we organized. We founded new committees and nominated and elected feminists to the executive councils of the ASA and regional professional associations. We set up a model child care program at the 1972 ASA meeting and challenged the ASA to do the same in the future, which it did. We taught our colleagues about the importance of gender-neutral language and having diverse intellectual orientations represented on editorial boards. We very much improved the quality of ASA annual meetings for ourselves by creating the SWS room, where we could, and still do, drop by at any time to find, meet, and relax with other women, sociologists, and a few feminist men. And we taught ourselves many skills by exchanging information in SWS how-to sessions. Now, we were engaged in promotion struggles, and not days of struggle, but months and months and months, she says. So during this time, the newsletter published letters accusing SWS of professionalism, interested only in fostering the careers of women sociologists, forgetting working class and poor women, especially those in minority groups, And certainly our research and publications covered those issues. But then there was the question of where to publish. There was a suggestion at one point for SWS to sponsor sex roles. But since its focus was psychology, not sociology, that died. I will speak about the advent of gender and society in the late 80s at the editor's session on Sunday. So at the beginning of the 11th year, when I was just elected president, I published my thoughts on the 10th anniversary of SWS in the January 1981 newsletter. And what I said was, we have evolved into an organization with wonderful traditions, an institution, but without incrustation. The evidence of our solidity included the well-used hospitality rooms at SSSP as well as ASA, the extensive programs mounted during the SSSP and ASA meetings, the pride with which SWS members wore their pink tin ribbons, and the smiles of recognition they evoked in the hotel corridors and meeting rooms. We already had the traditions of the annual banquet and auction. SWS's main strength, I said, was that we became a clearly identifiable and significant community. There is no doubt that we now count in the sociological world. For ourselves, we became an important source of networking, the lifeblood of professional advancement. And this was all done by volunteers, producing the SWS programs at national and regional sociology meetings, organizing the annual mid-year steering committee meeting, editing network, running a job market service, compiling a directory of members, reviewing the feminist qualifications of ASA candidates for office, helping fight sex discrimination cases, voicing our opinion on social policy issues. Volunteers then did all the daily organizational work, which we are now glad to have done for us by our executive secretary, our executive officer, Barrett Katun. The most important function still of SWS is to be an informal sponsorship network for women sociologists, recommending new sisters, writing reference letters for hiring, promotion, and tenure, teaching each other how to do many skills. Now that we have gender and society, we also nurture and publish sociological gender theory, the backbone of today's feminism. To continue our record of volunteering, I highly recommend promoting yourself for office and committees. The presidency is now essentially a 3-year term. President-elect, president, and past president. You not only get to lead this wonderful organization, but you get to produce the programs at the summer and winter meetings. One day, we will be seeing each other face to face and be able to renew our friendships and make new friends and wear our SWS ribbons proudly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful historical look. I would like to ask if anyone has questions, you can place them in the chat. And we can also wait until the end. We will wait till the end to discuss them, but if you want to make sure that we get your question in, please go ahead and write it. Our next speaker is Esther Nyan-Ling Chow. She is Emerita Professor of Sociology at American University in Washington, D.C., and she taught there for 37 years until she retired in 2000. She mentored and supervised 66 graduate students, among whom half were doctoral students. Her publications include Race, Class, and Gender, Common Bonds and Different Voices, Transforming Gender and Development in East Asia, and Women, the Family and Policy, A Global Perspective. She's a committed feminist, scholar, teacher, activist, and is the person for whom the SWS Dissertation Scholarship is named. Welcome, Professor Chow.
You mute. You, excuse me.
Durr, please unmute Professor Chow. That's what happens when you mute, when the host mutes all, everyone has to unmute themselves. So
Yeah, I'm trying. There she is. Okay.
It's muted again.
Okay, I'm asking to unmute.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for asking me to make a few remarks on my early experience with SWS. When SWS was first established in 1970, I was a graduate student, study sociologist at UCLA. I started my teaching career at American University in Washington, D.C. in 1972, when my sprout and I could find decent jobs in the same city. At that time, I belonged to the Eastern Sociological Society and decided to attend its annual meeting held in New York City, where I met Lila Young, a sociologist teaching at Georgetown University. Lila told me that he had a mission to organize the New York chapter of SWS in New York City and asked me to join her, and I did in 1972. At that time, I heard about a group of feminist sociologists, including Jessie Barnard, Jean Lippman Blumen, or maybe Judith Lorber, who boycott a men's club in San Francisco. Since Jessie Barnard and Jean Lippman Blumen were living in DC, I have a privilege to meet them personally and attend Jean Lippman Blumen's feminist salon frequently and met many colleagues there until Jean moved away. As I recall, it was an inspirational gathering, not only build feminist network, but also develop feminist scholarship collectively. At that time, feminism was a dirty word and is often referred to a group of crazy women who burned their bras. The term was stigmatized at best, and this group was marginalized at worst. At American University, the sociology movement who hired me in 1972 offered its first women's study course. I was asked to teach it. I, with other women colleagues, were asked as pioneer to develop the new scholarship in an uncharted area. Outside of the academia, I joined the Organization of Women, which was established in 1965. At that time, very few women of color joined the organization. A Black woman, unfortunately, I forgot her name, attempted to organize a national organization of women of color. I admire her courage and leadership and finally joined her effort in organizing effort. Due to lack of funding and other reasons, her organization was terminated after 2 years. Then there was another group of women of color within the SWS organized a conference in 1977, which I served as one of the keynote speakers. Its organizing effort died down as well. In my recollection, I was thankful that Bonnie Deal invited me to attend her summer workshop for women of color at Memphis State University in 1982. I fortunately met Denise Segura, Elizabeth Higginbotham, Maxine Bacassin, at the workshop from whom I learned from them about diverse kind of women and their identity, strengths, and culture. I no longer see women as Black and white and begin to develop the intersectional knowledge about diverse kind of women, their inclusiveness and uplifting spirit. To me, SWS have been the most steady feminist group I belonged, as its membership increases year after year. However, I've observed that there was very few women of color sociologists who joined the group. Mary Joy Green and I were the oddballs, standing out in the group. As an Asian woman, I did not have a critical base network to align myself in my struggle at that time. I was not Black enough to be Black, not white enough to be white. That means I basically fell through the cracks. Then I decided to be myself, making friends with those who accept me regardless of their race, class, gender, sexuality, for they are all human beings whom I value as their colleagues and friends. Now, I'm thrilled so many women of color have joined SWS, which is led by Josephine Beoku-Betts. Under her outstanding leadership, SWS has strived to an ideal to serve diverse kind of women, to realize their vision, mission for equality, justice, and peace. Finally, I wish to be remind us what SWS stands for. It is sociologist for women in society. It is not only governed by women, but it is for women of diverse kind and serve them in society. Thank you for giving me an honor to share my thought and experience with you. Thank you.
I wish we could all unmute just so that the person could hear our applause, but maybe we could have jazz hands to show our applause. But thank you very much for your honesty and for your recollections. It is helping us all to understand who we are and where we started and where we are going. I would next like to introduce Pat Martin. Professor Martin is Emerita Professor of Sociology at Florida State University. She became active in SWS in the early 1970s and attended winter meetings from 1976 onward. She served as Vice President of SWS in the early 80s and as President in 2012. During the 80s, she served as Chair of the Journals Committee, which later became the Publications Committee. And she worked with Judith, Lorber, and others in establishing to the fact that SWS changed ASA as well as the Southern Sociological Society for the better. Its inclusiveness and support of women and people of color have inspired and guided SWSers for the past 50 years. So please, we want to welcome you right now, Professor Martin. You just muted again.
Okay.
And Professor Chow can mute if she would like.
Got it, I think.
Okay, you got
Is that it?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, this is, I appreciate this opportunity. It's my thesis that SWS is where it is today because of what happened in the 1980s. That's my decade for which I'm responsible. And my memory is full of holes, so all of you'll have to help me. But Judith, thank you for all the research you did. I want to begin by asking this question. How many organizations do we belong to that pay us to come to their meetings. Yep, there's one, and that's SWS. And why do you suppose that's the case? I'll tell you why. Judith Lorber and her associates in the leadership of SWS had the foresight and skill to bargain with the publisher of GNS or SWS to own our own journal. Our ability to pay members to attend meetings from royalties we receive from SAGE today is the reason we can do this. You need to contrast this with, say, the Journal of Gender Work and Organization in the UK, which SAGE also publishes. But they don't have ownership of the journal, and they don't get much money per year just for their editorial office. So we're very, very fortunate. And we thank Judith and Myra and Christine Bowes and all the people who had a hand in that. But there's more here about SWS. The 80s were a developing and a somewhat contentious time, as Judith's suggestions have mentioned. So here are the issues I'm going to cover. Founding and launching of Gender and Society, what the mid-year steering committee meetings were like, the endorsement of ASA candidates, which Judith's already covered, but I'll add one little bit, and whether to establish an office or a research center, and should we hire a part-time administrator. These were hot issues in that period because until Gender Society started to really pay, we didn't have any money, basically. So at any rate, that's where we're going. So let me start back up a minute. In the first 25 years of SWS, the president served for 2 years. And since we had no staff, this made all the officers' jobs pretty heavy duty. So who were the presidents in the 1980s? Judith was the first one, followed by Robbie Cohen, Janet Chaffetz, Beth Hess, and Francesca Cancion. Now, Janet and Beth have both passed away, and Robbie and Francesca have not been involved in SWS for many years. But Francesca is alive and well out in California, and I've been in touch with her on email. So she sends her greetings, and she wanted to say that her primary agenda when she was president was to increase diversity in SWS. So I want to get back to the journal. The group that pushed our journal idea decided to, Judith was able to acquire some funds from the Graduate Center at the City University of New York to occupy what she says a small, dark, cold office about the size of a broom closet. But she rustled $20,000, as I recall, which today would be about $46,000, to help launch the journal. I don't think our publisher was Sage back then. I think it was maybe Pine Forge. Anyway, SWS had previously suggested to, and the Sex and Gender section had in ASA, that they establish a sociology of gender journal because Signs and Sex Roles and Psychology of Women were the leading journals, and none of them took a sociological perspective on the issues. But ASA refused. And so Judith and associates ran with the ball. With the funds they could find, Judith had to establish an office, hire a managing editor, her second and long-term person, Susan Farrell, has been a wonderful SWS member, set up an editorial office, recruit associate editors, and deal with the myriad issues of, for example, how to cite people with 3 names, like Barbara Katz Rothman. Should we cite her as Rothman or Katz Rothman? Judith was insistent on the latter, and she prevailed. And she says that even the New York Times is doing this today. So she was a trendsetter. This issue turned into a battle royal for many moons. And another issue was the name of the journal. I don't know if you consciously thought about this, but we have Gender and Society, but we don't use the word and, we use the ampersand. This was another major preference of Judith. But there's more. Judith edited the first 4 years of the journal. And when I say edited, I want you to think capital letters and bold print, because the Judith required authors to rewrite and rewrite again their manuscripts. And often she rewrote them once more. those among us who edit know what a job editing is. It's an act of love, and it is time-consuming, thankless, intellectual hard work. So when I, at one point, asked Judith, why did you do this? Why did you invest so much? She said, to ensure that the original set of papers in the journal were good, and therefore set the journal on a good path. And in my opinion, she also set a high standard for succeeding editors. Okay, I want to shift now to the steering committee, mid-year steering committee meetings. I want you to think about this, as we called them steering committee. Whoever showed up was on the steering committee. So my first meeting in '76, I just was kind of trying to figure out what SWS was at the operational level, and I was as welcome as anyone else. Where were they held? Many times in the early years, they were held either on campuses or near campuses, like University of Maryland, Northwestern. We conducted our primary business at these steering committee meetings. Important issues were hotly debated and decisions were made. We had lots of divisions, East Coast, West Coast, and people who knew what they were doing and people like me who didn't. But anyway, being there was workout, and sessions were often loud and not particularly polite. So here's how a typical mid-year gathering tended to go. Everyone who showed up was in the loop. We sat in one room, usually in a circle, because there were just probably 30 to 40 people there. And away we went. Here's what the network news said at the time. The attendance at the meetings was low, partly because one had to pay one's own way from her home institution, and no one helped with expenses. So as a result of that, many of us stayed with friends in Washington, D.C. and New York City, et cetera. There were no academic presentations at all, as we have today. It was business only, except when we ate and sang and gossiped and visited. And as Pam Roby would have us do on occasion, stand up and do stretches to cleanse our minds and loosen our bones, as she would say. And Myra Ferry reminded me that in the 1980s, it became a tradition for Arlene Kaplan Daniels to pass her hat, literally, at the banquet to raise funds for the ASA Minority Fellowship Program. And I just want to say about SWS South, which I helped start in 1976. We did something similar for many years, and this sort of evolved into our auction. Myra also reminded me that the, quote, executive office was more a hub that coordinated and kept records. It was not a real professional setup. Our membership numbers now are not that different from the 80s, but we have a lot more money now because of our royalties from the journal. And but even when we had no money, we tried to help people who were having sex discrimination lawsuits against their campuses. If the discrimination committee of SWS viewed their causes worthy, but the amounts were usually like $500 or occasionally $1,000. Also at the winter meetings, and even at the ASA SWS business meetings, I remember Beth Hess doing this. Beth Hess was president from '86 to '88, and she would sit in one of our SWS meetings when she wasn't an officer. At the back of the room, she would sit there writing postcards, addressing them to former SWS members who had failed to renew their memberships. And if you weren't very slippery or quick, she would hand you a stack of pre-stamped postcards and addresses for you to write when you got home. I want to underscore that this was not something anyone asked Beth to do. She had no official role in making it happen. She just did it. That was Beth. Beth loved SWS, and she worked for her entire life. Okay, paid staff in an office. We're not as informed about this as we should be, at least I'm not. Barrett and I have tried to identify who SWS has hired over the years and what years. We don't know, but early on I know we didn't have anyone. But then we did have Barbara Tomaskovic-Deevy between 93 and 95. And then from 2006 to 2012, we had Jessica Sherwood. But we don't know much about that interim period. But at any rate, when Jessica had the job, she also edited network news and kept the checkbook. So it was a hub, but it wasn't a full-fledged developed situation like we have today. So at any rate, if any of you know the details, I'd love to hear them. The endorsing ASA candidates, as Judith described vividly, this was a mess. And I was vice president when these uproars were going on in the early 80s. And one of our former presidents resigned from SWS over this endorsements business. And I'll tell you why it was problematic. Yes, Judith, we did publish the results from the questionnaires, but we also had discussions at the steering committee meeting, which were basically anecdotal. And some people would say, like, he was a very good guy, but he put the moves on his students, or he never asked a woman to be his research assistant, or she really didn't like women. And we were going on personal accounts, sometimes secondhand, about whether these people should be endorsed. And you can understand how this made a big fury. And I, as vice president doing this at the time, really knew about this. I also want to say that you gotta remember this was pre-internet. So the questionnaires for all the ASA nominees had to be mimeographed and mailed out, and then they had to mail them back. The astonishing thing was they did mail them back. And early on, we asked those questions that Judith summarized, but later we expanded out a little bit and said, have you done anything, either in your institution or more broadly, to improve the status of women, their opportunities, and policies regarding sexism in writing and whatever. And related questions we usually ask, are you an SWS member? And then we were still, though, in those days, making these results public. But when we stopped this was when we had such an uproar, it just wasn't worth it. And we began to benefit then. There was a great hostility toward us when we were doing this. And you might imagine some poor soul maybe partly deserved being rejected, but might not have totally deserved being publicly shamed. Okay, in closing my remarks, I want to admit that I opposed SWS founding a journal. And I wasn't subtle about it. I remember a session, I don't remember where it was in Boston, where Judith and Myra and Chris and other people on the panel were on the stage, and I just raised Cain. I loudly objected to this. And what had inspired me was Jesse Barnard's concern that the Society for the Study of Social Problems had converted SWSP, in her opinion, to a society that lived for its journal rather than focusing on social issues. This worried me for SWS because it was so important, the kinds of things that Judith was saying we did and continue to do, of supporting women in our departments and in our professional associations and in society at large, doing other things besides for sociologists. I was afraid we would lose that. Well, the good news is I was wrong. And SWS founded Gender and Society. So this is a good SWS story. So here I've been carrying on about this, you know, what a bad idea. What happened? The SWS powers that be turned around and asked me to chair the journals committee, later the publications committee, to help Judith launch this new journal. And I agreed to do this and was grateful for the chance to. And I'm so grateful I lost that particular argument. I want to end on that note because over time, I've had many myths with SWS, and I know others have as well. Some people I know have withdrawn altogether. And as I said, one former president quit over the endorsements. But when SWS keeps its eye on the ball to help women in society, not just women in sociology or women in SWS, it deserves our support. So I believe that we SWSers tried to do that, as I noted in a 2013 paper on this struggle some time ago. So I encourage us to embrace former members, if you know any, who have become disaffected, and ask them to give SWS another chance. I challenge us all to live up to SWS's standards, so we will not disappoint people again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate hearing your perspective and your focus on the 80s, and it's just been such an enlightening, it's not a conversation, but it feels like a conversation this afternoon.
I agree, thank you.
Appreciate your candid. I'd like to introduce Catherine White-Berheide, who is professor of sociology at Skidmore College and principal investigator for the NSF-funded grant SUN, Skidmore Union Network, supporting women faculty in STEM at liberal arts colleges. She has authored dozens of articles and is co-editor of 3 books, including, sorry, I'll have to find that. But I'll let you know in a moment. I can't find my notes. In 2003, she won the American Sociological Association section on teaching and learning, the Hans Mauch Award for distinguished contributions to undergraduate sociology. She served a 2-year term as president of SWS in 1990 through 1991, and she chaired many other committees in our organization, including nominations and local arrangements. From 85 to 89, she was part of the committee that established Gender and Society before becoming the first chair of publications from 86 through 88. And most recently, she chaired the investment committee. So welcome.
Hi. I want to sort of tell a story here, starting with, because I'm in some ways the first of kind of the next generation, if you will, of people. When I went to graduate school, there were virtually no women faculty at Northwestern, where I got my PhD. And they hired Arlene Kaplan-Daniels as sort of the first full professor woman who didn't come along with a spouse, where they hired her because they wanted the spouse, the male spouse. And Arlene negotiated for a leave of absence. So I never actually was there when she was there actually teaching. But what she did do was bring SWS there for a mid-year meeting. And that was my first official introduction to SWS as an organization for women. We had a sort of chapter, if you will, in Chicago that brought together women at the University of Chicago. So that would have been Ellie Miller, who became president, if not directly after me, then the next term. So she also was in the 90s. And at the University of Illinois Chicago campus, where Pauline Bart was. And Pauline hasn't come up in the stories yet, but she was a prominent figure in those early days and throughout all of those many meetings. And I can reaffirm how contentious those meetings were in the 1980s when I started to attend them. And I also want to reaffirm that we had no money. So everything had to happen by figuring out how to make it work financially. And so in 1985, when I agreed to organize and remember we had no staff, so I agreed to organize the mid-year meetings in the Albany area. Skidmore is just north of there. The way we funded the meetings was using this idea that Arlene had of the road show. So what a local arrangements person did was to arrange for members to speak at local colleges and universities, and then their speaking fees went to underwrite the cost of the meetings. And Chris Bowes was putting together at SUNY Albany a mini meeting, if you will, a small conference on women in work. So we actually had the mid-year meeting in April that year so that we could bring in all of these women sociologists who are a member of SWS to be speakers at that conference. And then I brought another set of them up to Skidmore to do a panel on family, because gender and family, because Chris's meeting's topic was on work. And we met in a motel across the, I think it was called the Tom Sawyer or something like that. I mean, we're talking low rent here, literally, to do this, to put all of this together. In the meantime, Myra Furry and Chris Bowes and Judith and others had submitted the request to the ASA Publications Committee to come up with a journal, and the ASA turned us down. And I succeeded Myra as chair of the section on sex and gender, so was brought into that process at the end of it. And I remember at the 1985 meetings, Richard Hall hosted us at his house. He was then chair of the SUNY Albany Sociology Department, and we sat around in his living room with Carla Howery and talked about founding this journal. And then later on, Chris and I and other people went to Beth Hess's house in New Jersey to make the final arrangements for putting this all together for SWS. And then everybody on that committee Judith became the first editor, Myra and Chris became associate editors, and we looked around the room, and all of a sudden the only person left who wasn't going to be an editor or associate editor of the journal was me. And I had not applied to be an editor because I didn't have the time to do it. Since I'm at a teaching intensive institution. And all of a sudden I landed the job of being the first chair of the journals committee and thought, oh no, let me be an editor. That will be less work than trying to chair the first journals committee. I then needed a committee, and that's when Pat Martin and some other folks came on. And so we then went on to sign the second contract with Sage Publications, and it was with Sage Publications, not Pine Forge, which after all is just a subsidiary of Sage, under my term as president. And Mitch Allen, who was our editor at Sage, said to me as we're signing it, well, let me just tell you that when we signed it, that's when Sage, they were so happy with the journal that they actually gave us money for the office. And we were happy. I think it was about $10,000, and we just thought that was miraculous. But Mitch Allen, who was our editor, said to me how happy Sage was with the journal. He said, you know, we started another journal at the same time, and it hasn't done anywhere near as well. And I said to him, oh, Mitch, what was that other journal? And he said, Rationality in Society. And I, who am usually pretty diplomatic about things, looked at him and said, well, I could have told you that. I mean, the idea that Rationality in Society would do better than Gender in Society is just baffling to me. At any rate, after my, when you're president in this era when we had no money, you had to, of course, work with a local arrangements person to put together these mid-year meetings. And so I talked Mady Siegel into arranging my first one at the University of Maryland, and I talked Marcia Siegel into arranging my second one at in Louisville, Kentucky. And she put together speakers to go to the University of Louisville and to Indiana University Southeast, and I think maybe to Bellarmine too, but I've forgotten that. But what we were trying to do at that time, and Pat mentioned this, is we really were working very hard on trying to diversify the organization. And so particularly for the Louisville meeting, I had the theme of that include working on mainstreaming race and ethnicity into our teaching about gender. And so worked with the women who were at Memphis State, who had a Ford-funded center for women of color, and had done wonderful workshops on integrating materials about race and gender. This, as Esther said, was when we were first beginning to think about things in an intersectional fashion. And so my work built on the work that Frances Kansian had done just prior. It was a really difficult struggle, and it took a long time to get to where we are on that issue today, but we worked very hard on it. The only other thing I want to add that happened during my presidency was that we had a controversy about a very senior male, senior professor at a research university and getting an award, and his claims of sexual harassment against him. And so I had to organize a whole session about his work and about the concerns about him as a person, sort of a precursor, if you will, to the Me Too movement and some of the issues that happened most recently as well. So we, that session happened actually at the ASA meeting. So it was more public, if you will, concerning SWS's concerns about his behavior. So the things we see happening today had their roots in the past. I then want to just remind everybody that when we re-signed with SAGE, I think it was 2010, it was Denise Segura's meetings in Santa Barbara. And we were getting from SAGE a $100,000 signing bonus for re-signing for Gender and Society with SAGE Publications. I was at that moment secretary of the ASA, and SWS mid-year meetings was discussing whether to donate that $100,000 to the ASA for the Minority Fellowship Program. And as you know, we in fact did do this. But I can say, having been at ASA Council, number one, how grateful ASA was for that $100,000 bonus, but also how deeply concerned they were about the decision that had been made not to agree
psychologists
to
defenses and resistances and
to publish the Gender and Society Journal, and that when the race and ethnicity section came to ASA Council to ask to publish a journal on race and ethnicity, the answer was absolutely yes, and multiple people made the comparison to Gender and Society in their regret over not having that as an ASA publication, and that not wanting to repeat that mistake that they made. So the only other thing I want to mention is the involvement of both the Sex and Gender section and the SWS in bringing childcare to the ASA. This is something else that other people have alluded to, but ASA finally sponsored childcare in 1984 at the San Antonio meetings. There had been enormous resistance to that at the ASA, and now it is standard practice. So the other person, Esther, of course, was able to talk, and she mentioned Mary Joyce Green. I just want to mention Doris Wilkinson, who also was a very faithful and important member of SWS in those early days, African-American woman who went on to work for the ASA, and I believe was one of the early people working on the Minority Fellowship Program, and therefore one of the reasons why SWS has been so intimately involved in that. And Myra is absolutely right about Carla. I want to mention Carla's involvement not only with childcare, but with the teaching workshops and emphasizing integrating gender and race into the teaching of sociology, but also how important she was for our auctions. So Arlene, of course, was at the beginning of creating these auctions. These were a way to raise money. And Carla took over and did them until she was too ill to continue. So, we have these folks without whom this organization would not be what it is today. And I just wanted to mention how important they all were to us and how important Judith was as that first editor of Gender and Society. And she'll probably tell the story about how she got the Weston Zimmerman piece in that first year. But we were absolutely dedicated to ensuring that the first year of the journal, those first years of the journal would be so good that of course we would become the prominent journal in this area. But even in that prominence, we never believed that it was going to make the kind of money that it makes now, and that it would be able to underwrite the organization the way it would now, so that we don't have to figure out how to arrange our mid-year meetings. And so we can actually fund multiple minority fellowship people, and so that we can fund an office. So I want to thank everybody for the work that they did that made it possible for us to be the organization we are today. Thank you.
Well, I tell you, I mean, I'm glad that we're recording this, because we're all learning so much about the nitty gritty, as you'd say, about our wonderful organization and the leadership and the different strategies and ways that women have negotiated for our success. I'd like to, I want to mention two of Professor Berheide's books, included in sociology, Learning Climates that Cultivate Racial and Ethnic Diversity. And she's also the editor of Women, the Family and Policy, A Global Perspective. All right, so I'd next like to introduce Professor Marlese Durr. She is Professor of Sociology at Wright State University. She is a Senior Fellow at Yale University in their Urban Ethnography program, and she's a Research Associate at the Center for the Elimination of Minority Health Disparities at the University of Albany. Her research focuses on African American women in managerial positions in public institutions, alongside specialized interests in labor markets, social networks, entrepreneurship, inner city neighborhoods, and stressful life events for African American women. Oh, maybe Professor Barnard, if you could mute yours.
If a capacity for transference.
Okay, thank you. So Professor Durr, the research that focuses on includes social networks, entrepreneurship, inner city neighborhoods, and stressful life events for African American women. She has served as president of the Society for the Study of Social Problems in 2014 and sociologist for Women in Society in 2004, 2005. She was also chair of publications for Gender and Society. She currently serves as an advisory board member for Social Problems. She's a member of the ASA Publications Committee. She's on the ASA W.E.B. Du Bois Career Distinguished Scholarship Committee, and she's a founding editorial board member of the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, the journal that Professor Berheide was just talking about. So welcome, Professor Durr.
I'm unmuting, and is that what I'm supposed to do? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's been interesting for me to hear the stories, because it's going to put what I'm going to say in perspective. Early to late 90s, when I was finishing, well, 80s, and I got out in 93. So when I was finishing graduate school, there was always this idea of working about gender. But for me, I remember we had a class and Professor Spitzy and I think Chris Bose came by and said, which is, important, gender or race or something like that. And I remember saying, race, of course. Okay. And over time, I began to learn that there was a link between gender and race. But still, formally, even going to ASA, most African-American women didn't hear very much about SWS. And if we did, it was all very negative. So Esther forgot that she cornered me in South Carolina, her and Mary Joyce Green, and got a commitment for me to remain a member of SWS forever. After the commitment, I go to my first meeting, and ironically, I did not understand what putting a chair up against the table meant. In the community that I come from, you just put your pocketbook there, you tell your friend, tell somebody that's my seat, hold my spot. Well, it turned into a very embarrassing situation. And I fled the meeting in my head. I said, I can't do this, because nobody talked to me. It was very uncomfortable after this very, very famous professor, who shall remain nameless, yelled at me. I was storming down the hall and I ran into Chris and Myra. I was so angry. I don't know if I was crying or on the verge of crying. But Chris and Myra came back and sat with me, and it allowed me to continue to come to the meetings. And I came to the meetings and I worked on committees. But race was still an issue by the time I became president. Barbara Risman and Myra, who worked very diligently, thought about how could we bring more women of color into SWS. And that has been a discussion or a theme throughout each and every presentation so far. I remember one meeting I attended as a graduate student. Judith Lorber walked up to me and shook my hand and warmly met me. That was the same thing for Kate. That was the same thing for Pat. But many other people would shy away from women of color. For them, another issue was, as good as Gender in Society was as a journal, they were very concerned that they were unable to get articles published into them. So for them, being a part of SWS was a non-plus, because they still thought that they weren't going to be seen. So I worked with Barbara and Myra. I did believe that they would work together, and they wanted to see diversity. And from 2000, I think, forward up until the time I became actual president, we had a very vibrant kind of relationship with the Association of Black Sociologists, where we did programming, we did sister to sister, before sister to sister, to have all kinds of roundtables and activities with women of color. But it took a lot of work that sometimes, how do I say this, unconsciously, things would be done that were racial affronts. No one would say anything, but they just disappear. I'd walk in the hallway and I'd hear about it in the hallway. Or they'd see me and they say they were never going to join again, and they'd say, how do you stand being there? And I would explain to them the kindness and how they had to come and work, and they would say, oh, you should leave. And I said, no, I'm going to stay. I stayed. And one of the first things that helped us bring more people in, I inadvertently, based on a comment that I thought was rude, became the chair of the publications committee. I really didn't know what I was doing, but not my teacher, but a professor in my department, Christine Bose, gave me the kick, and I learned pretty quickly. From that, people I would talk to would thought it was a big thing. So publications for them was still an issue in many ways for many African-American women. Still understanding SWS and gender and society publications is an issue, but maybe not so much anymore. They still talk about having a woman, a Black woman, a Latino woman, if you will, become an editor. But I've also said to them, it's an application process. And I think Chris Williams worked with me. Unfortunately, my school didn't have the money to be a deputy editor. I hope somebody will work with me later in the future. But Chris Bowes became a person that, as I talked to many women, along with Myra, along with Judith, along with others, that I sought to talk to say that they're going to help you. And my response was, they're not going to take into consideration being nice to you over and above teaching you what's right. Everything would not be a race issue. But they also wanted to build relationships. That was the other thing. Many of them didn't feel quite so comfortable. So when we had, my theme that year was teaching method and practice, building a global community of women. What I really wanted to do was find things and have people participate in things that were global, that we could reach across the aisle and do things. I remember I did Transgender 102. I think one of the first sessions that we had done on that, because I had known some women who wanted to talk about this. We talked about the life trajectory of an academic career. And for many African-American women, this was a problem, promotion for them, how they could speak, how they could act, translated from not feeling comfortable and just talking in the coded language that women of color would talk to one another with. It played out in SWS because they were really concerned about who they spoke to, how they spoke to them. They weren't really sure about the relationship. And it took a lot of work. And for many, many years, we worked to build that. So as the president, there was constant pressure on me in a couple ways. I always felt like I had to be the best president possible because I was the first. I was the first Black publications chair. I was the first SWS president. And I think Chris might remind me, I think I was one of the first African Americans to graduate from Albany. Here I was, this really scared person. But I know people are laughing, I can hear it. Nobody thinks I'm scared. But I was very frightened at that time, but felt that I needed to speak up for many of those people. As Sister and Sister came along later on, it was based pretty much on the model that Barbara and Myra had started and they allowed me to become part of. But the journal still remained a sore spot for many women of color. Many women of color didn't have mentors that would work with them or help them to write papers. It was always a source of contention for them because they didn't feel that they had anyone in the departments that they could turn to get papers published. They weren't sure how to go about doing special issues. So it was always really good when SWS co-sponsored these writing workshops with the Association of Black Sociologists. SWS was a good partner during that time. And I think to some extent, the Association of Black Sociologists was. We had members of SSSB, but not that many. But the other thing I wanted to do as president was to bring into focus issues for women of color. Drug or substance abuse was an issue for a lot of women of color. HIV concerns was an issue. But more importantly, I would raise these things, pardon me, as part of the stressful life events that they had. It was really well received and we began to move along in that way. But then as time went on, we noticed that there were all kinds of awards for other women within SWS and all kinds of accolades. And we thought about the Memphis Four. Okay, that's the research group. That's Bonnie, now I'm forgetting their names, but the Memphis Four, we called them, that had done a lot of things for African-American women. And we thought back to Esther, and we thought back to Mary Joyce. Mary Joyce Green was an African-American woman who was always ever present like Esther, but marginalized as well. She would come to the meetings, she would move around, she would work, she would do things. And once again, an issue of how and why people remained part of SWS was based on what we call microaggressions today. But that back then were really insults. They were pushed, they were shoved, they were ignored, they were spoken to in not such kind ways. I can't say that that's totally ended, but I can say that we've worked very hard on it. I mean, Elizabeth Higginbotham, one of the Memphis Four, Bonnie Thornton-Dill, second part of the Memphis Four. Now I see her name, she's tall, she's got glasses, it'll come to me. We all talked about in different ways, in different aspects, without saying what we're saying, how to make this change. SWS during that time made the change. Over time, we got more and more women of color. More and more women of color came, they stayed, and it's been continuous. Doris Wilkinson, as I see Myra's comment, was also a person who looked out for women of color, but she was also a member of the Association of Black Sociologists, and she was also part of SSSP, so she had a large network and a wider point of view. But at the same time, many African Americans saw her as an insider, as a person who was chosen. They would listen, they would give that respect, but there was always that feeling. So to kind of round this out is that we did finally get to a point that we built relationships. We did get to a point that we could overcome some of the issues that dealt with race, some of the issues that dealt with academic elitism. And we still have some of those and some of those issues with us. And we did get to the point where people felt that they could bond with one another. Hello, is my time up? Okay, so
you have about another minute.
Okay, so the bottom line, thank you, Mignon. To round this out, SWS lived up to its commitment to diversity. All those bad things, now here we go. We have continuously brought in women of color. We have worked really, really hard to make a change, to mentor, to hold on to one another and see one another through. More importantly, what I have found rewarding is we can have our fights. But our fights don't keep us from hanging on to a major purpose. So from graduate school through being the president, as many people thought it was time for me to be the president after I've worked very hard, I have to say it was, is, and will remain a rewarding experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There's so much here that we're putting on the table that's important, and it's important for us to understand different perspectives and experiences as we grow. So thank you very much, Professor Durr. I'd like to introduce Professor Bandana Purkayastha. I hope I said it properly, Bandana. Please forgive me if I did not. She's Professor of Sociology and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Her research on human rights, intersectionality, transnationalism, migration and migrants, violence and peace have been published in several books, articles, and chapters in the US, in Germany, India, South Africa, and other countries. elected and nominated positions at the International Sociological Association, the American Sociological Association, of course, our beloved organization, and the Society for the Study of Social Problems. And she continues to serve on expert committees internationally. She has received many awards for her research, teaching, and leadership, including the Hirabayashi Award for the co-edited book on human rights in the US, and a career award from the Asian American section of the ASA in 2016. Most recently, she was the co-winner of the Jesse Barnard Career Award from the ASA, and she currently serves on the executive committee of the ISA. Please welcome Bandana, everyone.
Thank you. It's been such a feast listening to everybody else that, I want to just thank everybody and move on just so I save time for Josephine. I actually belong to the generation of SWS members. I think I joined either in 99 or 2000, first as a graduate student and then as a faculty member. So the past history, which I've already heard about, was very interesting to me. I was the president-elect in 2012 while Pat Martin was president, and I'm going to come back to this because Pat deserves significant accolades for several things she did. Of course, I became president in 2013. Now, SWS's vision at that time, as it has been before, had been about remaining feminist, deeply feminist, engaged in activism, scholarship, but always with social justice in mind. Within this larger vision, my goals when I was elected was to pay heed to two initiatives that members were talking about, but were not as prominent in particular ways. So my overall vision, at least through my term as president, was to, I should back up and say I had three overall goals. The third really was a challenge. I'll come to that. So my first part of my vision was to emphasize feminist knowledge in the 21st century. That is, SWS members had already started talking about what was going on in the world and how did we fit into those initiatives. So I wanted to work on that in particular ways. Now, some of the initiatives were already in place. When Myra Furey was president, she had brought international scholars to her conference. I think that was the first SWS conference I attended. Chris Bose, as editor of Gender and Society, had commissioned a whole series of internationally focused feminist research articles. Joya Mishra, who was the editor at that time, had already made huge inroads into the process of globalizing gender and society. What I wanted in many ways, based on what I was hearing, was to have members hear directly from outstanding scholars in the global south. And to use a contemporary term, that we needed to decolonize our feminist knowledge and practice, not simply by saying, oh, we were inclusive of women of color here, and I have something to say about that as well, but also not to just stay in our comfort zones and say, oh yeah, and we want to include the global south and do nothing about it. So we actually ended up hearing from a galaxy of scholars, including Amina Mama and Jane Bennett, both of whom were involved in setting up the African Gender Studies Institute. It's located in South Africa, but had significant consequence for many countries on the African continent. And Joya Mishra had invited Kalpana Kannabiran, who was at that point on the editorial board, and Kalpana happens to be one of the preeminent Indian sociologists, literally in the world today. I also, in this endeavor, not to fall into this, oh, that's international and this is local, I wanted to feature some of our SWS luminaries. So people like Mary Osram, who then went on to becoming the first non-white provost of Bryn Mawr College. Feature Margaret Abraham, who then went on to becoming the first non-white woman and the second female president of International Sociological Association. Feature Josephine Beoku-Betts as a speaker. And I'm not talking more about Josephine because hopefully by now you know what an awesome scholar and leader she is. And of course, to build on the issue that Marlese and others talked about. So not just making it about either women of color or white women, to also feature significant, scholars who've done a lot of international work and included Myra Marks-Ferry, Shobha Hamal Gurung, Jeannie Flavin, and a whole lot of other people. Now, goal 2, again, reflecting on what was happening on the ground for SWS, was to keep strengthening the piece that Marlese talked about, that for decades, people had been working to try and attract and welcome scholars of color. And of course, all those initiatives that had happened before, while I was, still a novice member, that is setting up sister to sister network. I remember being there. It was awesome. The fact it continued, the fact it got more power in the organization. Setting up the Mary Joyce Green and Esther Chow board. I remember the huge discussions, tears, all of that happened. But we got it, and it's a significant issue. I remember the ASA Minority Fellowship. All of these had been done, but we had to keep doing more. We could not stop. And so the other goal was to put together and make sure there were programming, there was space to continue to be inclusive and continue to be inclusive. And again, as Esther mentioned, and then Marlese mentioned again also, to send out the signal that we are not just talking in terms of, white and black, we are talking in terms of all kinds of diversities. When we are saying inclusive, racial diversity being a very significant part of it because of past structural discriminations. So SWS already had this practice of putting its money where its mouth was, so to speak. And one of the things that I'd also heard that I wanted to make sure we achieved as part of this vision of, what are we doing in practice, was to somehow also link or, ally ourselves with some Indigenous people's issues. As many of you know, that the location of the conference that happened during my time was set in, these were the criteria that I was drawing from. It had to be in a state that was not anti-union, very important to our members. It had to meet the green standards that Tracy Orr as president and other people had set up. It had to support local economies of marginalized groups, in this case, Indigenous groups. So we found one of the places that met all of these criteria and found a hotel that was significantly owned by a Native American group and had a significant Indigenous employee base. And these two facts become important, as I talk about some of the challenges that emerged as a hurricane, really as a hurricane. And here I want to turn to talking about really Pat's term in 2012 and my term in 2013. And Wanda Rushing was treasurer-elect and treasurer at this time. We changed executive offices 3 times. And in those days, changing executive offices meant that we would have to change and switch the listserv, which used to be housed at universities. It included new sets of searches. It involved new search committees. It needed negotiations with potential executive officers and their universities and new states. And as we were trying to do this, we recognized, Pat recognized it first, and I followed through on what she started, that we virtually had almost no formal labor policies that were actually consistent with the laws of the land. So all of those had to be put in place. Pat found a lawyer with whom Pat spent so many hours. I don't remember how many hours she spent. I certainly remember one long trip to Binghamton, New York from my home. So about 3.5 hours, one shot. And this lawyer said, I don't need to be paid fees for this. Y'all are a good feminist organization. I'm happy to help you solve these, put into practice the labor policies and so on and so forth. So those have to be done. Now, putting into practice these laws meant that we were going to move away from the feminist collective way in which we would operate. So it also involved this challenge of trying to convince members that yes, we had a culture in SWS, and yes, we were moving towards greater bureaucracy, but this bureaucracy was needed both to protect people who would work everybody works and volunteers for SWS, and this includes all executive officers, putting countless extra hours in. But just the part that people are paid had to be governed by some policies. Pat started them, I followed through with it, and it was a hard task, but we got it done within that time frame. To make matters more challenging, some of our feminist decision makings about money, Kate Berheide talked about, money starting to come into SWS, which also meant all of us felt, well, we have money, we can do feminist things. Many of those feminist decision makings, which made 100% sense on the ground, believe me, I was part of one of those decisions that was made, which I can't describe because it falls under personnel issues, turned out to be absolutely against IRS rules. So we were in very deep trouble regarding our accounting practices, based on monies we had given people. We all agreed to it as a good thing, but it didn't fit in with our status with IRS. Some former employees, and we had many in little bits, hadn't paid their income taxes, and Wanda Rushing, in her role as treasurer, had to go and straighten all of these out with the IRS, which, as you understand, was not a pleasant thing to happen. I think we talked every night. I think Pat, Wanda, and I should have gotten sick of each other, how much we talked. But I also want to acknowledge that so many other members, and this is the part of SWS that you can never talk enough about. Nobody blocked my calls. I was calling people at all odd hours because I needed help, we needed new committees, a whole series of things, on and on and on, relentlessly. And everybody stepped up and helped. For example, the investment committee, Kate Berheide had just finished a term as ASA secretary. I knew we needed an oversight from SWS over our investment professionals, and we needed people who knew what they were doing, because the presidents and the council really didn't have enough knowledge. I begged Kate. She had every reason to say no. She said yes. Same with Don Ferry. Same with a whole bunch of other people. Okay, the other challenge, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, was that...
You have about a minute left, Bandana.
Pardon?
You have about 1 minute.
Okay. So another challenge that we faced at that time was a labor union called for a boycott of all Hyatt hotels. Well, our site was a Hyatt hotel, and I got a lot of pressure, both from that union as well as other organizations, to just walk off our contract. Well, here we are, Native American, significant management, Native American employment in a relatively poor area. Were we just going to walk away? We were going to have to pay, if I remember correctly, $60,000. How do you make these decisions? But SWS members, oh my God, they were wonderful. I put it out to the membership and everybody supported us. What were the key accomplishments? I think meeting that goal 3, stabilizing SWS's labor policies, setting up kind of the pathway for the later bylaws and straightening out our financial operations. It basically, I think, really, even today, pulled our organization from an abyss that is just still unbelievable to me today. And the fact that we did it quietly, but effectively, I think was the biggest accomplishments of that time. Along with that, you understand that changing 3 offices creates a lot of talk, lots of rancor, correctly, lots of questions about what were people up to. But the fact that we overall kept peace and kept the avenues of bonding, mentoring, friendship open amongst various sectors of SWS was very, very important. And as it was pulling off that conference, organizing that conference in the middle of the mayhem that was happening in the background was difficult, but it worked and people still talk about it. I'm very, very grateful for that. I want to acknowledge, amongst other people, Director Tuna, Rushali Patil, Heather Lobby, Ronnie Titchener, Rosanna Njiru, Anjana Narayan, Ranita Ray, Shweta Durr, whole bunches of people who did so much of extra work to keep SWS going. I also want to really do a shout out. I'm not naming all of you, all of the women, family of friends of color, as well as other women who pitched in whenever there was something to be done and did it. The last question,
Okay.
my presidency, I just want to
Okay.
begin with this. That is, I would like to
We
advise,
have to end.
yeah, I would like to advise people that think of putting yourself in SWS's history. Run for office or just be there, lend your talents, keep the bridge to the past firm. And of course, you're going to have to mold a future that's going to be very different from the decades before. So all the best in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have our final presenter on this illustrious panel this afternoon, and that's none other than our president, Professor Josephine Beoku-Betts, who is Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Sociology at Florida Atlantic University. Her research and publications focus on women's political activism in post-conflict Sierra Leone, African women in academic scientific careers, and women in education in Africa. She is our president. She is the former co-president for Research Committee 32 of the International Sociological Association, and she's co-convener of the African Studies Association Women's Caucus. Josephine, Wright Scholar at the University of Sierra Leone in 2011-2012, and then again in 2018-2019. She has received awards for her scholar activism and leadership, including the SWS Feminist Activist Award and the Florida Commission on the Status of Women Florida Achievement Award. We have a warm welcome for you, Josephine.
Thank you, Mignon. What can I say? I'm sorry about the image, but I have problems with my computer. But anyway, everybody said so much, I don't even know what to say, but my own presidency comes at the time of COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd and police brutality in the United States, anti-racist riots in the US and around the world. And this comes together with our 50th, well, at least beginning to come to the beginning of our 50th anniversary celebrations. So it's really a good time to look at where we are. We've reached a certain stage of maturity at 50, and it's a natural time for us to reflect and take stock of how far we've come and the challenges we face and how we've navigated these, and looking forward to another 50 years ahead. So I'm going to focus specifically on my experiences and insights just over this past year. Well, because even in my year as president-elect, I was in Sierra Leone as a Fulbright scholar. I did participate in council meetings and everything, but I was away for that year. And also in talking about what has happened over the past year or two, I would have to bring in Adia Wingfield and Tiffany Taylor, because they are the presidents that precede me. And a lot of the initiatives that I talk about have been started by them. But I think as we have matured in terms of our vision and goals, we've gained a lot more breadth and depth at the same time. And I think one consistent area that all the presidents have spoken about today and that we've continued to build on and that we're still struggling with, how do we address the concerns and issues of our membership? And I think one term that captures all of that is the concept of inclusivity as an intersectional feminist organization. That is what we're striving to become and build on now. And in fact, a task force on inclusivity was set up by past President Tiffany Taylor, I believe. And the mission was to recommend changes that would create a more inclusive organization by lessening the power dynamics and inequalities among committees, among the membership, some of the issues that have come up in some of the discussions today. And so they did a survey of the membership, and the objective of that was to begin this process. And one of the main recommendations out of that was to revise the mission statement and the bylaws, because at the end of the day, that is what we build our organization on, those policies. So the vision where we're working towards now, it's not that any of this is new, but it's building and strengthening on our vision. And we're trying to create a more intersectional mission statement to reflect our inclusivity and an intersectional feminist organization that is more action-oriented and representative of the scholar activism of our membership. And so in terms of the bylaws, we're working towards ensuring that we're more critically reflexive. This has come up in a lot of the discussions, presentations today, but we actually want to put that down now, you know, that we want to be more critically reflexive as an organization in the wording of our bylaws and procedures, and that we create more accountability systems for council, for example, in ways that will build its capacity to improve relations with historically marginalized committees and members. So one of the ways that we've been working on in the past few years has been to increase our social media presence and strengthen our sexual harassment policy, the work of the academic justice and discrimination committees. And we've always been doing work on mentoring, but so I'm not absolutely sure whether I've got this right, but I think we are establishing now a mentoring task force formally. We're also strengthening our mission and goals, also extends to our relationship with and alliances with other sociology organizations to help develop best practices and to create a united front that can build our capacity to protect our members and connect them to various options, resources, issues that meet their needs and concerns. That's where we are moving now. What are the challenges we've encountered? Well, over the past couple of years that I've been, I won't say we've had any major challenges, but we have faced some challenges. And I think these challenges at the same time have emboldened us to come into our own as an organization as we re-envision our mission and goals as an intersectional feminist and scholar activist organization. Over the past 2 years, some effort was made by council to reevaluate our needs as an organization in terms of ensuring a sustainable and profitable growth as we move forward. So this involved some amount of restructuring of our financial advisors, our investment portfolios, setting up a feminist futures account that we could invest in whatever funds we have over to for our future growth, because the money coming from gender and society may not last forever, you know. So we need to become more independent in how we address our financial situation. So this created some tension regarding whether this was a necessary step to take at the time, how the process of contracting a new set of financial advisors was being handled. So this was all at the time I was coming in, and I was like, what's going on, you know? But the matter was ultimately resolved, and we had detailed and transparent discussions among members of council, with the membership at the business meeting. I remember last year's summer meeting, there was a lot of tension there. But we also invited the new financial advisors to come and talk more about what their proposed initiatives were for strengthening SWS's financial portfolio. A new investment committee was formed, and it now includes the past president, and also a member of the former investment committee is a member of that investment committee. So that's one. Another one I would say was the unexpected impact of COVID-19 and the racial protests resulting from the murder of George Floyd and police brutality and institutional racism. That's had a traumatic impact on our professional and personal lives. And because both pandemics have disproportionately affected the lives of Black and Brown communities, who are most often the targets of police brutality. So SWS had to quickly organize to meet the various needs of its members. For COVID-19, we had a town hall meeting to determine what were the needs of our members and concerns at this time, and so we brought them together. We had council meetings, brought the committees, the executive office, of course, to provide particular resources and services to targeted groups. And so this culminated in a number of targeted meetings, which were covering faculty concerns, job market concerns, global concerns, writing groups, because at this point now, everybody's at home, what they call it, shelter. Anyway, we're all at home working remotely. And so there are all these things that were going on that we had to see, how can we meet the needs of our members at this time? And we set up self-care groups, and also even addressing research concerns of our members who, graduate students, for example, who were doing field work in Peru or somewhere else. How were they going to proceed? All of these things have had to be discussed in the past few months. And so some of these meetings are still ongoing. For example, the self-care and the writing groups are still going on. And then there are others that address specific tasks which they've completed. In terms of the protests against racial injustice, we prepared 2 statements endorsing the Black Lives Matter movement and against systemic racism and white supremacy. And of course, these were all posted on our website. And we've provided a list of resources highlighting the scholarship, the expertise and voices of our Black feminist scholars, particularly those who are SWS members. The SWS Council has also signed a memorandum to adopt the ASA Black Lives Matter research statement, which we adapted to acknowledge and condemn. Because what was happening is that in some universities, there are faculty who are doing research and on protest movements and sending their graduate students and undergraduate students to do the work, participate in these protest movements. And this is very dangerous, you know, situations, because it might even result in death, arrest, and all of that. So that was something we felt very strongly about, that we needed to endorse that and take a position on that. But we've also signed several endorsements over the past months supporting various social justice issues. Most recently, I would say, we've been successful in meeting the challenge of planning. The fact that we're here and having this first virtual meeting, that has been a challenge, but having a full-time executive officer who is committed and dedicated as a feminist sociologist and an excellent administrator has made all the difference in helping us to navigate the technological needs of planning this meeting, but all the other things that I talked about as well. And so I really want to use this opportunity to thank Barrett and Natasha and Christelle, the program planning committee, Sasha, Solange, Mary Beth, all of you, but especially Barrett, thank you. What are accomplishments? I don't want to keep on repeating myself, but I think having a full-time executive officer has made a lot of difference in our capacity to professionalize the organization and accomplish many of these goals, which we've been talking about. So we've increased our recruitment of SWS members. We're about 50 members short, roughly, of 1,000 at this point. And many of these members are graduate students who now constitute 40% of SWS membership. In fact, we have 2 elected representatives from the Graduate Student Caucus on council. And one of the things I'm very excited about is that a growing number of our graduate students we're recruiting are also internationally based. And I encourage members to support them. I won't say much about our journal, which continues to be one of the top journals, feminist journals and sociology journals. And we'll hear more about this in the third plenary on Sunday at 1. So I hope that some of you will attend. I think we've developed a strong activist voice professionally, and forging our collaborations with like-minded professional organizations to provide a united front on issues of common interest. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that we as SWS have set very high standards in our awards revocation policy for members, past and present, who have failed to comply with a sexual harassment policy. And we've taken a stand on that. I won't go into that much further, but this is one thing we've done. And I think we've set an example for other professional organizations.
Coordination of benefits.
Also, I want to give a shout out to our work internationally in the United Nations. We're a professional NGO now through representation of our international committee, and they have a session after this one, by the way, but we're a member of ECOSOC, and we have representation as an NGO on the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And I think the work they've been doing is really impressive. And I think this brings another aspect of the accomplishments of SWS. I think we've also strengthened our international collaborations over the past year and before, but through definitely working with our global partnerships. And again, Bandana talked about that, but I have come in as president. I have been interested in expanding and developing that side of our mission as well. And so the building on the work that Bandana and Chris Bowes and others have done in terms of internationalizing the organization, the 2020 meeting we had in San Diego was looking at feminist futures in the global South. And we also addressed migration, border politics, and we looked at the growth of women's studies because we were in San Diego, where the first women's studies program was celebrating their 50th anniversary as well. And also, we're beginning to bring in international graduate students. I'm happy to report that the Barbara Rosenblum Cancer Dissertation Scholarship Award winner this year was from Nigeria. I was so surprised to find out that this was somebody actually based in Nigeria and doing her PhD. There are at least 3 graduate students here at this conference who are presenting, based in Ghana, Nigeria, Trinidad, and Tobago, who are participating in this conference as we speak. And I just want to end up by just saying that our members have achieved senior leadership roles in ASA and so many other organizations. I can't mention them all, and I think it's come up in a lot of the talk. But even just suffice to say that most recently, our own Christine Williams, the current president of ASA, Joya Misra is the ASA vice president, Mary Romero, the past president of ASA. And while we can't take credit for all of this, it's clear that SWS is fulfilling its mission in providing a space to nurture its members and build future feminist leaders through its mentoring programs, its networking, social action initiatives, and so on. And the last point I just want to make is that what I've enjoyed most as being president is the opportunity to introduce my own vision in the 1 year that I'm going to be president, and do things that I think will help build and add another layer to the accomplishments and work of SWS. And so that has been something I've enjoyed doing. But also, I think reaching out to our global partners and friends to collaborate with us on things like curriculum and writing project, again, strengthening those relationships as we move forward. But finally, another thing I have enjoyed about SWS has been the dedication and commitment of all that I've worked with. And I think I'm echoing what my colleagues have said before, starting with our executive officer, Barrett, who is a sociologist in her own right. And I mean, she's able to understand and anticipate the needs and concerns of our growing membership. Our colleagues on council, which includes our 2 graduate student representatives, the way everybody's willing to volunteer, to serve on a task or a new initiative when called on to do so. And, you know, especially at a time like this with all the demands of us having personally and professionally, I'm just amazed at all the work that people have undertaken just because we love our beloved SWS. And my advice to those people who are interested in taking on more leadership roles in SWS is to become more involved in committee work, talk to members who have served as members, as chairs of committees you're interested, find out what the expectations are and what the realities are of doing that work. Because the organization is growing and changing as we move forward, and you want to be in lockstep with that. And I think you also have to be prepared for the position of president. This involves, you need to plan ahead. If you want to be president, you need to plan ahead by informing your institution, for example, of your plans and try to negotiate a course release or two during your tenure as president. I'm not at a Research One university where I'm not even sure all Research One universities give course release and all of that. But I think the position of president does require, demand some of this now, and I think you need to plan ahead for that. You must also consider, and I think SWS should also consider giving, if universities are not willing to support their faculty in that way when they're president of the organization, that we should be able to supplement that by a course release for one president. You must also consider your publication plans and your commitments so that they don't conflict with juggling with the presidency, your position as a full-time faculty or applied sociologist, and your personal life. Because all of these matter, because you need to maintain a good balance and healthy balance. And that's all I have to say. And happy birthday, SWS.